Good morning. Welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and today we're talking about hallucinations. Did the disciples hallucinate the risen Jesus? This is a topic related to a book that Dr. Andrew Loke has recently written. And let me just introduce him really quickly and then talk about the book. Andrew Loke is associate professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's the author of God and Ultimate Origins, the Teleological Argument. That's forthcoming. The Origins of Divine Christology, a cryptic model of the incarnation, and this is the book we're talking about today, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. That book is linked in the description of this video. One of the coolest things about this is that it's free. You can actually just go get it right now and download it for free on Kindle on Amazon, which is amazing. In addition, he's also published articles in leading international peer-reviewed journals such as Religious Studies and Journal of Theological Studies. He was also on Capturing Christianity recently in a debate with Dr. Graham Oppy, where they were talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, which was a whole lot of fun, and we're hoping to have them two back on together as soon as we can, so long as the holidays just kind of got over, and so we're just going to see if we can schedule something else. But today we're talking about your new book that you released. How long ago was it now? It wasn't too long ago.
Yeah, it was in around April or May last year. So just a few months old. Yeah.
Right. So how did you make it? How did you convince your publishers to make it free on Kindle?
Well, my publisher wasn't convinced by that, but actually it was funded by my university, or partly funded, right? So I applied for funding to make this open access, and my university graciously gave me the money. So thank God.
That's amazing. Yeah, so let's start with telling me about why are you defending all of these different things about Christianity? So like you've written a book on God and Ultimate Origins, and you've written a book on defending the resurrection of Jesus. So why are you interested in these topics in the first place? Why are you interested in giving a sort of defense or an apologetic for Christianity?
Well, two reasons. The first is, ever since I experienced God and became a Christian, I've been very motivated and very passionate to share my faith, right, with my friends and other people, right, because it's the good news is such great news, right? It gives us hope, meaning in life, eternal life, and so I want to do all I can, right, to help my friends to receive this good news, to receive Jesus and into their life, so that they can also experience the wonderful joy of believing in Christ, right? The abundant life and the eternal life that we can have in Christ. And so as I do that, I find that, they wrestle with a lot of questions, right? So my friends or my students, for example, those from mainland China, right? They have great difficulties believing that there's a God who created the universe, and they have difficulties believing in miracles. And so as I try to help them, I do a lot of research myself, and my research eventually become these books, right? And so this is the first reason. And the second reason is because, I have doubts myself, right, from time to time, right? I'm sure almost all Christians will have, right? Any thinking Christians, right, who think about questions like this, right? Did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Or is it just, some kind of legendary story, right? So like many other people, right, I wrestle with these questions. And so I also want to find answers for myself, right? How do I really know that what I believe is true, right? So actually, the second reason is actually the main reason, I would say. The first. So actually, I wrote the books for myself, actually, right? To try to answer my own questions, right? So
to really think sort of systematically through some of these questions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you can tell that in the book, especially in your book on the resurrection. Well, I guess in your book on the origins, on Ultimate Origins as well. I've noticed that what you do, you provide a really good like overall summary of the current dialectic of like what people have argued on both sides. And what's really neat about it is that even if you're just looking for like what are some of the most contemporary or latest things that people have said about the resurrection or about the Kalam cosmological argument, this is a really great place to go for something like that. And then obviously Andrew will, or Dr. Loke will give his own thoughts on the current dialectic and some of his responses and everything, and that's sort of the apologetic value to the works. But in any case, it's still worth just checking out and getting like the summary of like where people are at right now. So getting to the topic for today, we're talking about hallucinations, whether or not the disciples hallucinated the risen Jesus. So the reason why this is what I wanted to focus on for this interview, because you talk about a whole lot of other things in your book, is that this is probably the number one view among skeptics online and on YouTube. And if I weren't a Christian, it'd probably be something that I would lean toward, I think, is the view that the original disciples had some kind of experiences, but they weren't like it wasn't actually Jesus that was there. They were hallucinating. Something was going on. And so that's what I wanted to focus on. In your book, you make some helpful distinctions, clarifications, and then you kind of, one of the things that you say in the introduction of your book is that you want to provide a kind of overall case against all of these different naturalistic theories. And so I wanted to focus on this one in particular because I just think it's probably the most popular one. So let's get to the specifics of your book. So in your book, you make a helpful distinction between intra-mental and extra-mental hypotheses. So would you mind taking a few minutes and explaining that distinction for the audience?
Yeah, so I think before I do that, I think it would be helpful for the audience to let them know that the overall structure of my book first, right? And then in order to understand the context within how I situate the discussion right between the extra and intra-mental hypothesis. So can I share my screen with you? I'd like to share a PowerPoint slide. Which
let's go ahead and do that. I'll try to get it set up on the screen. It might take a second, but go ahead and start sharing when you're ready.
All right.
I still got my my coffee. I normally only drink coffee in the mornings. So when I do my streams, I try not to drink coffee because it makes me like too jittery. But I've got it today. I've got it this morning because we're streaming. As you're getting this up on the screen, we're streaming at 8 a.m. right now, and that's very unusual. We normally stream around 12 my time. It's the reason why we're doing it so early is because Andrew is over in Hong Kong. Yeah, feel free to share your screen. I can't see it yet.
I can't see my PowerPoint on the screen actually. I don't know why. But I think I can share it. I don't know why. Okay, never mind. I think I'll just go through without sharing the screen then. I can see there's some technical problem.
Okay. Yeah, and you were mentioning, Andrew, that you're in a hotel right now, so that's part of the reason for the backdrop, and we were actually having some minor connection issues at the beginning of this. So forgive us for technology is awesome, but it does have some downsides. Well, yeah, I mean, we'll go through we'll go slowly through the overall structure, and then I'll maybe jump in and ask some clarifying questions if I think it'll help. Sure.
Okay, so actually the proof, right, is actually quite simple. I lay out in a syllogistic form, right? So in chapter 2 of my book, I explain the historical evidence, which shows that the earliest Christians, such as, for example, the 12 disciples and 500 over people and other apostles, they claim that they saw the resurrected Jesus, right? So we have historical evidence to show that there were these people and who make this claim. So given that this is the case, there are two possibilities, right? Either they didn't see anything, but they claim that they saw something, right? So either they didn't see anything, or they did see something, right? So either they lied about this, or they did experience something, right? So if they did experience something, then there are two possibilities. Either their experience were caused intramentally, right? And by intramental, I mean things like hallucination or dreams, right? Where the experience is caused by the psychological factors is purely inside the mind, right? Without anything outside the mind that correspond, right? That stimulate the sensory organs, right, to produce these sensations, right? So that's what I mean by intramental, right? So either their experiences were caused intramentally, or their experiences were caused by something outside their mind, right? That there is somebody or something there that caused them to have this experience of seeing the resurrected Jesus, okay? So if that were the case, then there are two possibilities, right? So if it's extramental, then either that extramental thing is something else other than Jesus. Maybe it wasn't Jesus, right? Maybe they mistook another person for Jesus, right? Misidentification. or it was Jesus' body, physical body, right, that they saw, right? So if it was Jesus' physical body that the Jesus body that they saw, then there are two possibilities, right? Either Jesus didn't die on the cross, or he did die on the cross, right? So if he didn't die on the cross, there are two possibilities. Maybe he was crucified, but he didn't die. No, he was crucified, but he just fainted, and then was buried, and then 3 days later he woke up and somehow push away the stone and tell people, "Hey guys, I'm alive." Or he wasn't crucified, right? So either he was crucified but didn't die, or he wasn't crucified at all. Maybe they crucified the wrong guy. Jesus ran away, and then 3 days later he came out again and said, "Hi guys, I'm alive," right? So either right, he didn't die, or he did die, right? He was crucified and he died on the cross. And if that were the case, then what this implies is that the earliest Christians, what they saw was the Jesus who was dead and who was alive again, right? Which means that they saw the resurrected Jesus, which means that Jesus rose from the dead, right? So if we analyze the case for Jesus' resurrection in this logical manner, we find that there are only a few possibilities, right? So all the different hypotheses can be reduced to a few of them. So either they didn't see anything, or they hallucinated, or it's an instrumental hypothesis, right? Hallucination or dream, whatever, or they misidentified something or somebody else as Jesus, or Jesus wasn't crucified, or he was crucified but he didn't die, right? Or he resurrected, right? So there are only these few logical possibilities, and I exclude all of them, right, on the basis, or I exclude all the naturalistic alternatives in my book, right, chapter by chapter, right? So in chapter 2, I argue against the hypothesis. In chapter 2, I established that there were these people, right, who claimed to have seen Jesus, and in chapter 3, I show that they did saw something. In chapter 4, I argue that what they saw is something outside their mind, right? And in chapter 5, I argue that this person was indeed Jesus, and also that Jesus did die on the cross, and therefore I established the conclusion that Jesus resurrected from the dead.
So I want to focus on chapters 4 and 5 just for a little while, and then we're going to turn to some Q&A with the audience. So in chapter 4 of your book, as you just mentioned, you argue that the earliest Christians experienced an extra mental reality, wasn't just completely internal in their minds. And then in chapter 5, as a quick review, you argue that the extra mental reality that they experienced was Jesus. So let's start with the claim that you make in chapter 4. So why think that the earliest Christians experienced an extra mental reality? So this would be to rule out something like a hallucination.
Yeah. Now, I will talk about this. I would indeed talk about the contents in chapter 4. But before that, I think it is important, right, to say something about chapters 2 and 3 as well. Now, one important reason why is because before we address the hallucination hypothesis, right, we need to ask ourselves, how many people actually experience something, right? How many people actually experience something? So was it only one or two, or was it quite a lot of people, right? Now, a lot of apologists will argue on the basis of 1 Corinthians 15, right, verses 3 to 11. And they'll argue that, well, 1 Corinthians 15 say that there were groups of people, right? There were 12 disciples, and there were 500 over people, and there were other apostles, right? There were 3 different groups of people, right? And so on the basis of this, they argue that it is very unlikely that it could be a hallucination, right? Because mass hallucination is very unlikely, right? And I will explain later why, right? But however, the skeptics challenge this premise, right? So, for example, Bart Ehrman, right? He argued that, well, it wasn't 12 disciples, it wasn't 500 old people, right? So these were later embellishment, right? This is how Ehrman argues. Ehrman thinks that Bart Ehrman thinks that there are perhaps only a few people, maybe 3 or 4, right, who may have individual hallucinations, right? And then later on, as the message spread, right, the people exaggerated, right, and make it like 12, make it 500. And so that's how the skeptics will explain away, right? And that's how they make the hallucination hypothesis plausible. That's how they make the hallucination hypothesis plausible, right? Because there were only 3 or 4 initially, right? And then
some skeptics online argue there's only 2.
Yeah, that's right. Paulogia. I was about to mention actually.
Right.
Paulogia. Such an amazing coincidence. that was the next sentence I want to say. That Apologia thinks that, well, he wasn't even 3 or 4, he was maybe only 2, right? Peter and Paul, right?
Yeah.
And he thought that Peter and Paul had hallucination, right? So before we address the hallucination hypothesis, I think it is important to ask ourselves, right? How many people actually had the experience, right? This is a key question, right? Now, Apologia responded to 1 Corinthians 15 by saying that, well, he likes to use the phrase, "cause the Bible tells me so," right? Okay, that 1 Corinthians 15 is taken from the Bible, right? And so are you Christians saying that, just because the Bible says so, therefore it's true, right? Of course, right? The skeptics would not accept this easily, right? Now, my response is, we have to look at documents in the New Testament from a historical perspective. So we can treat them like letters that people wrote to another person, right? And it's just like me sending an email to you, for example, right? Writing letters nowadays. Nowadays we hardly write letters, right? We send emails, right? And by reading the letters, we can know what is it that the author believed and the circumstances they were facing, right? We can have some ideas about that, right? And this is really uncontroversial, right? So by reading my letters, for example, you know that I believe in Jesus, right? By reading my letters, you know that my circumstances, well, I came from Singapore originally, and now I'm in Hong Kong. I'm currently being quarantined in a hotel, right? So by reading my letters, you can know some things about what I believe and what I'm going through, right? And then we need to ask ourselves, right? How do you explain those beliefs, right? So when we read the letters of the early Christians, we can know what is it that they believe, right? They obviously believe that Jesus resurrected. They believe that there were people who saw him alive. And then we ask ourselves, how do we explain the origin of those beliefs, right? So that is the key issue, right? And when we think about these questions, right, we need to read the letters with a certain degree of common sense, right? Common sense. And this common sense is very important because sometimes I find it quite lacking, right, in some of the skeptics, the way they argue their case. By common sense, let me give an example, right? If you read my emails, when I write in my emails saying that I'm currently under quarantine in Hong Kong, you have good reason to think that what I'm writing is probably true because you can determine it by whom am I writing to, right? So for example, if I'm writing to my friends in Hong Kong, my colleagues in Hong Kong, right, and they can easily check on my situation, right, and so and they can also easily check the situation in Hong Kong, right, because they know that nowadays the rule in Hong Kong is that when people fly into Hong Kong, they have to be quarantined, right? So they know this for a fact. So I'm writing to people who can easily verify, right, my situation. So when we read with this degree of common sense, we will know that, well, there are some things which we have good reasons to believe are true, right? What this person is saying in his email, in his letter are true, right? And other things, well, maybe not, right? But we can use, we have to read with a certain degree of common sense, and this is important. And so when we read 1 Corinthians 15, right, there are at least 6 considerations which can help us determine that when Paul says that there were 12 disciples, 500 old people, and another group of apostles, right? There are 6 considerations for thinking that what Paul's saying is true, right? They were indeed these people, and that these people did claim and did experience something which they thought was the resurrected Jesus. Okay, so let me go through very quickly these 6 reasons, and then I will go on to review the hallucination hypothesis. Okay, so the first thing we need to pay attention to is the fact that Paul is writing to people, some of whom were skeptical about the resurrection. Okay, so Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:12, right, that he says that there were some of you, right, who say that there's no resurrection from the dead, right? And this, we have good reason to believe that this is true, right? Because we know that among ancient Greeks, for example, right, the ancient Greek worldview of Homer, Plato, they have no room for the resurrection, right? Some may do, but for many others, especially those more intellectual ones, they will find it very difficult to believe that a dead person, his body will be resurrected, right? For people for people who accept Platonic view, right, they think that after a person dies, the soul goes to heaven, right? The soul, right, is in a disembodied state, right? It's not a physical resurrection, right? And so it is very plausible to think that, well, there will be some people, right, who are skeptical about bodily resurrection. Now, I'm going through this very quickly, right? I give far more details in my book, but this is just an outline, right, of my response. And then the second reason, and by the way, these 6 considerations, right, we have to take them together, right? It's not just one. We shouldn't take it separately, right? But we should consider all 6 considerations together, right? And this is important. Now, the second consideration is that we know that this is a life and death issue, right, for the early Christians, right? Because Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He says, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile, right? So we know that the resurrection is something that's very important. It's foundational, right? It's foundational to their faith in Christ. And Paul also revealed that they were going through persecution, right? Paul says that, as for us, why do we endanger ourselves every hour, right? I face death every day, right? So if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, right? And so the early Christians were prepared to give up their life. Right? They were for their faith, right? So this is a life and death issue, and the resurrection is the foundation to that. And the third consideration, the third consideration is that people can check out if there were indeed these eyewitnesses or not, right? So Paul claimed that there were 12 and then 500 and then another group. Now the readers of his letters can easily verify if this is so. Why? Because we have intra and extra biblical evidence which show that the early Christian movement was a network of close communication, right? And the early Christian leaders, including the so-called eyewitnesses, including those people that Paul named, right? People like Peter, James, and others, they were preachers, right? The apostles, they were preachers. They were going around preaching. They were quite mobile, right? They were moving around, and many, also many Jewish Christians, those Christians who were Jews among the early Christians, right? They will travel every year to Jerusalem for festivals, right? So they were movement of people around, right? So people can easily move around and chat with one another. And most of these supposed eyewitnesses that Paul named, that Paul claimed, right, about this, most of them would still be alive in the year AD 55 when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Why? Because this is very early, right? This was Paul's letter was written very early. Is within 25 years after Jesus' crucifixion in around AD 30. And in fact, Paul was passing on a tradition, right, which dates even before that, right? And that's why Paul says among the 500 over people, most of them remain until now, right? In 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verse 6, right? Among these 500 people, most of them are still alive, right? So Paul is actually saying that most of them are still alive and inviting the readers to check for themselves. Paul says this. Paul is saying that if you don't believe, you can go and ask these people. They are still around. Right? They can be verified. You can verify with them. And Paul could never have. And Peter Kraft, a philosopher, says Paul could never have done this and got away with it, right? If this is not true, right? So Paul could never have done this and got away with it, given the power, resources, and numbers of his enemies, right? If this is not true, we need to understand that Paul was writing under close scrutiny, right? I mean, he has enemies inside and outside the church, right? People were trying to discredit him, right, his credentials. And so Paul could never have said this and got away with it, right, if this is not true. And moreover, the letters of Paul indicate that Paul knew people like James, Peter, and other apostles, and he personally met them and talked with them. And more importantly, Paul knew that the Corinthians knew them too, right? So Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12, right, Paul says that, you know people like Peter, Apollos, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says that, you all say, how come the other apostles, some of them have wives, right, and things like that. So Paul knew that the Corinthians knew the apostles, right? And this is very important because some among the Corinthians were evidently familiar with the teaching of Peter, and they knew James,
hey, Andrew,
and they were aware of other apostles. Yeah.
Can no longer hear you, but actually it looks like you're still coming through. So continue. And let me know if you guys are listening in the live chat. Let me know if you can hear him or if you can't. Something happened maybe on my end.
All right. Let me continue. Okay. So it's important to note this because the assertion of eyewitness testimony made by both Paul and the apostolic formula was easily open to falsification, right? Unless as must have been the case, that Paul and the Corinthians both knew perfectly well that it was correct. Okay, so it's just like me telling you, Cameron, right? I mean, if this is not true, then it's very unlikely, right? You'll be like me telling Cameron, that yesterday, hi Cameron, your wife told me yesterday that she was visited by Donald Trump, right? Of course, I wouldn't say this kind of thing, right? Because I know that you can easily check, right? You can easily find out whether that's true or not, right? So I won't be so silly, right, to write that kind of thing to you, right? And so it is the probability of that is close to zero, right? I won't be so stupid. And Paul certainly wasn't a stupid guy, and he knew that he was under scrutiny, and he certainly wrote what he knew that other people also knew, right, is correct, right? That this is the fact, right? He wouldn't have wrote this unless he and his audience knew perfectly well that this is the fact, that there were these people who were around in the first century claiming that they saw Jesus alive, right? The 12 disciples and the 500, etc. And so, so these are some of the important considerations, and I have 3 other considerations, but I think I will stop here and move on, right? Because I think these are already enough to establish the conclusion, right? That in the
I just wanted to say real quick that I didn't plan to do this before, so it's just gonna take a second, and I think Andrew, you can just continue talking, and it shouldn't be a big deal. But what I want to do is put up 1 Corinthians 15 on the screen for everyone to see. So continue talking, and hopefully this will give some people some context.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So as I said, given those few considerations, that's the reason why, right? We have good reasons to believe that in the first century there were these groups of people, right, who claim to have seen Jesus alive. And I have other considerations too, and I mentioned in chapter 2 of my book, right, I give further considerations to establish this, but I think what I've said so far is really enough to establish this conclusion. And so given that this is the case, we need to ask, right, so these people, right, there were these people claiming that they have seen Jesus alive, right? Could these people be lying? Could it be a conspiracy? Could it be that they didn't see anything but they claim they saw, right? Now again, this is very unlikely because as many scholars have already mentioned, right, these people were willing to sacrifice themselves for their faith, right? So people will not be willing to sacrifice for what they knew is false, right? A lot of people will be willing to die for what they think is true, even though that may not be true. But you won't find groups of people, right, who will be willing to die, right, for what they know is false, right? So if these people never saw anything, but they make up the story, right, they claim that they saw, then they'll be dying, right, for what they know is false. And that is implausible, right? And so so this is the first reason against this view. And then the second reason is that we need to understand, as I said just now, the resurrection is something that is fundamental about their faith, right? It's the foundation. So lying about such a fundamental concerning their faith will be inconsistent with their devotion to the God of Israel, which they evidently were committed to, right? So when we read when we read the letters of the early Christians, we can know what is it they believe. We can know that these people are actually very sincere about their beliefs, right? They believe that there's one God, God the Creator, and they were willing to give up their lives, for believing this God. I mean, the early Christians would rather die than to worship Caesar, for example, right? They wouldn't call Caesar the Lord, right? They would rather die for their faith, rather than to worship another God. So they were very devoted to this God, and they believe that this God is a God who will judge people, right? So according to their Jewish faith, to mislead people to believe that Jesus was truly divine, and by making up the resurrection, they will be judged guilty as false witnesses. And this is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 15, right? So Paul says that if we didn't see anything, if this is not true, then we will be guilty of being false witnesses, right? And they'll be condemned by the God of Israel, and it will lead one another and the rest of humankind astray, right? So as I said earlier on, when we look at history, we will find that many people are willing to die for what they believe is true, even though it might not be true, right? But they will be willing to die for what they believe is true because they for example, a lot of people will be willing to die for their belief in God, whatever, because they believe that if they die for their faith, they will go to heaven, right? But you won't find a large groups of people who will be willing to die for what they know is false and to be punished by God after death, right, for what they know is false, right? To be sent to hell by God, right, for what they know is a false, right? That is just implausible and impossible psychologically, right? To find all these people who will be willing to do that. And moreover, if they didn't actually see anything, why didn't anyone leak out the hoax when they were under persecution? Or even without persecution, some people may just leak out the hoax, right? So when we look at the history of religion, we will find that, for example, there were other people who make some claims about other people, right? So for example, I discussed this in chapter 8 of my book. In chapter 8, I discussed a case, there were a few cases, such as the case of Chave. Have you heard of him before, Cameron?
Who?
Chave.
I haven't heard of him.
Chave. Yeah, he's a very interesting Jewish teller, who claimed to be some kind of messianic figure, right? And he had some followers actually, and after he died, right, there were a minority of people who claimed that he resurrected, but the majority of his followers reject that claim, right? They think that, well, he was just a false messiah, right? And this is documented, right? And so we know that there are people who just say that, well, this guy is he's a fake messiah, right? And then there are also other people like Menachem Schneerson. I discussed him in chapter 8 of my book as well. He's another Jewish figure who some of his followers claim that he was Messiah, and after he died, some people, a tiny minority of his followers believe that he resurrected. But then the majority of his followers disagree, right? They wrote down in their letters very clearly that he didn't rise from the dead, right? So they disprove the Elokists who think that he did rise from the dead. So we find a lot of evidence here, right? Of even the followers of this so-called messianic figure, that they would reject the claim that they actually rose from the dead. But when we look at the letters, when we look at the evidence of earliest Christianity, we find that the opposite is the case, right? We didn't find any documents in the first century among the followers of Jesus, who say that, well, actually he didn't rise from the dead. He's just a good prophet, or he's just a good teacher, but he didn't rise from the dead and he's not God, right? We didn't find this. I mean, there were controversies about the divinity of Christ, but that came later on, right? In the 2nd century, for example, we find that there were people like the Ebionites, and then the Arians in the 4th century, right? They dispute the deity of Christ. But then in the 1st century, we find that among Christians there were widespread agreements, right, that Jesus was resurrected, and not only that, he is the second person. He was divine, truly divine. So we saw that the worship of Jesus already began in the 1st century, right? I discussed this in my book, The Origin of Divine Christology, published by Cambridge University Press. So given all this evidence, and I have a lot more to say, right? But I shall pause here and just conclude that on the basis of this evidence, we have good reason to think that there were indeed this. It was not just 2 or 3 people, right? It was multiple groups of people, right, who actually claim that Jesus rose, that they saw Jesus alive, and that these people did experience something, right, which convinced them, and that's why they proclaim, right, to other people. Now, given that this is the case, we now then go on to think about the hallucination hypothesis, right? So given that this is the case, is the hallucination hypothesis plausible? And my response is no. And there are at least, 5 or 6 reasons, right, why the hallucination hypothesis is implausible given what we have established so far. Now,
so Andrew, I want to highlight the distinction that you make in your book between the intramental and the extramental again. I think that term, I want to see that used more widely, because I think it actually is really helpful. And it can kind of parse out some of the different explanations that are on offer. So feel free to use that if you want to, or if you don't. I mean, hallucination hypothesis is like what most people are accustomed to. If you're already into apologetics, which probably the majority of people that are watching the stream are sort of into apologetics and everything. But I think that term and that the distinction that you make there is really helpful. So right now we're looking at, again, just as a quick recap. So what Andrew just got done arguing is giving several different reasons for thinking that there were multiple people who experienced the risen Jesus. And so then we're turning back to the question that I asked a few minutes ago about chapter 4 of his book, where he argues that the earliest Christians experienced an extra mental reality, something beyond themselves. It wasn't just a purely mental thing that happened. And so he's about to give his reasons for thinking that that's the case.
Yes. So, and under this intramental hypothesis, right, it not only involves hallucination, but it also involves things like mass hysteria, for example, right, which is quite popular nowadays. I think I saw some people arguing that it was a mass hysteria, and so now, so we need to distinguish, understand. So what is the difference between hallucination and hysteria, right? Now, hallucination is supposed to be some kind of experience. So, for example, hallucination can be of different types, right? So there can be visual hallucination, which means that you actually see something when there's actually nothing outside your mind there, right? So visual hallucination or auditory hallucination, that you actually hear something when actually there's actually nothing making noise, right? So hallucination concerns sensation, whereas hysteria is a delusion, right? And delusion concerns belief, right? It's not so much sensation, it's about believing, right? So a mass hysteria would be like a group of people believing that, they suddenly get very hysterical. They say, Jesus rose from the dead, we believe it, right? So it's more about a kind of a collective, it'll be a kind of collective delusion, okay? Now, so what do we do with mass hysteria? Now, it's important to note that mass hysteria cannot do the job here. Why? Because in this case, as I've argued before previously, that in this case there were people who not only believed that Jesus resurrected, but there were groups of people who actually experienced something, right? They actually claimed that they saw, and they indeed saw something, right, which convinced them that Jesus was alive. So hysteria cannot explain this away, right? We need to because we need to explain what is it that they saw, not merely what they believe, right? So hysteria can only explain what they believe, but cannot explain what is it that they actually experienced, what they saw. So we have to explain what is it that they experience, right? So what they experience, is it a mass hallucination that they experience, right? So this is a question that we need to ask. And as I said, there are multiple reasons why mass hallucination, right, is implausible. Now, firstly, it is unreasonable to think that a group of people could be perceiving the same thing together at the same time when there's actually nothing there outside their mind corresponding to their experience, right? And they have to be perceiving the same thing. They have to perceive Jesus, right? Because they were claiming that they saw Jesus, right? It's not that somebody see Jesus, other people see Mary, whatever. No, they were claiming that they saw Jesus, right? It was Jesus they were claiming. And it was unreasonable to think that a group of people could be having that kind of experience when there's actually nothing outside their mind that stimulated their experience, right? And one reason is because the intramental process, right, is supposed to be it's supposed to occur in the absence of external causal relation, right? Given that this is the case, it is unreasonable to think that the causal mechanisms internal to each person could simultaneously generate similar experience that are consistent with one another when there's actually nothing outside their mind, right? So this is implausible, right? That's the reason why mass hallucination is implausible. And hallucination will be something like a dream, for example, right? So dream is something that is intramental. No, it'll be like so for example, I have a dream that I went to Hawaii with my wife last night, right? And of course, if I check next day with my wife, hey honey, did we go to Hawaii yesterday? Of course, my wife would say, no, what, right? She would easily, right, disprove my thought, because this is not something that we can share together, because there's nothing external that corresponds with my experience, right? So it's very unlikely that my wife could be having exactly the same experience. Even if she also dreamed about Hawaii, it's very unlikely that our experience there in Hawaii will correspond, right? So I might be skiing in Hawaii, she might be having a dinner in Hawaii. It won't fit, right? And we can easily discover that that's the case by just comparing our stories, right? So so this is the first and second reason. And given that, and third reason, even if mass hallucination can happen, it will be extremely unlikely, right? But in this case, we have multiple groups of people, right? We have 3 groups of people in a short period of time, all experiencing something, right? So it is unlikely and unlikely and unlikely, right? And so given this, this is absolutely ridiculous, right? To believe that this is just explained by mass hallucination. And so the hypothesis should be rejected, right? And fourthly, we know that the early Christians, their experiences, their psychological states would have been varied, right? Because there were evidence of doubts and fears of persecution among them, and this is understandable, right? Given what we understand about their circumstances, and so given that they have varying psychological states, it will be even more unlikely that they'll be having this mass hallucination together. Now, and the fifth reason is that even in cases of individual hallucination, right? In cases of, there's hardly any well-documented case of mass hallucination. I mean, Gary Habermas claimed that there's no such case in peer-reviewed medical literature. I have done a search in PubMed myself, and I also cannot find any. Right, but even if there are any, it's going to be very unlikely, as I said earlier on. But there are well-documented cases of individual hallucination, right? So even for cases of individual hallucination, there are studies, psychological studies, which show that numerous subjects are able to achieve insight that their experience is hallucinatory after their experience ended, right? So, for example, there's a psychological study in which the psychologists ask a group of people to ask individual people, right? They do it individually, and they say that, okay, close your eyes, and I'm going to play White Christmas, right? And after the test, they ask those people. After this, they ask people, okay, so do you actually hear White Christmas? Now, actually, it wasn't played, right? There's no recording played, right? Even though they were putting their earphones, but actually there's no sound, right? But there were some people who thought that they hear who thought that they hear White Christmas, right? So they have this kind of auditory hallucination. But then, among those 49% who had this experience, the majority, 44% out of the 49%, the majority of these people are aware that the recording was actually not played, right? So they thought that, so they hear something, but after that they reflect. When they reflect on experience, they think, maybe it wasn't true, right? So they were able to achieve insight, right, that it was hallucination, right? They were able to tell that it didn't happen, right? And this is for individual hallucination, and how much in the case of mass hallucination, it'll be much even easier, right, for people to tell that it's false just by comparing stories, as I said, right? They would because they'll be seeing different things, and and people do talk to one another about their experience, right? This is common sense, right? Given that this is such a shocking experience, seeing Jesus alive, right? What do you see? When people will definitely ask one another, this will be commonsensical, and so they will easily tell, right, that they are seeing different things, and they will easily know that this is false, right? And people in the first century do know about hallucination, right? They do know that there are such things. I mean, they do know that people will sometimes see things which are not there, right? So, for example, people know that if you drink too much wine, right? They have too much wine, right? They'll be seeing things or hearing things, right? People know about these things, right? So people can tell the difference between what is hallucination and what is caused extramentally, right? They do know the distinctions, right? And they also believe in ghosts. They also believe in visions. They believe in such things. So if they didn't actually experience some things together in the same thing together and had the same experience, they would have easily known that they wouldn't have believed that Jesus resurrected, right? They would have, some of them may believe that he hallucinated. Some of them may believe that they hallucinated. Other people may believe that, well, maybe it was a vision, maybe it was a dream, maybe Jesus was exalted in heaven, but they won't come to the widespread consensus agreement that he was bodily resurrected. That wouldn't have been the case. So in order to persuade these people that Jesus was actually bodily resurrected, right, there must have been some solid evidence of the physicality of Jesus' resurrected body, right? Such as the experiences of Jesus being involved in meals, eating together with the disciples, eating fish, for example, right, leaving behind causal effects, right, and witnessed by multiple disciples, right. And indeed, such descriptions of their experience were indeed multiply attested, right, in first century documents. I mean, you find this in the Gospel of Luke, we find this in the Gospel of John, and also in Acts, right, and also outside the Bible as well, right. So, for example, in the letters of Ignatius, right, it says that the disciples, Jesus eat and drink with them, right. And so we have multiple attestation that Jesus left behind multiple causal effects, and it was the experience of Jesus was multisensorial, right. People see him, heard him, touch him, and so they were very of course, when we read the writings of skeptics, skeptics think that, well, these are all embellishment, right? They think that this is probably not true. Now, my response is that if this was not true, we can't experience how is it that they would come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was bodily resurrected, right? As I argued earlier on, they must have this kind of experience, right, in order to explain how they come to that conclusion, and therefore we have good reasons to believe that these accounts are correct, right? They must have this kind of solid evidence, right, in order to come to the conclusion that Jesus was bodily resurrected as a vindication of his claim, right, to be divine, as I argue in my other Cambridge book. Now, finally, one more consideration. If this is just a group hallucination, right, why did the resurrection appearances, these appearances suddenly stop after 40 days with Jesus' ascension? And then later on, there's only Paul, right, who saw the resurrected Jesus. I mean, after that, of course, there are various visions of Jesus, right? So, for example, in Revelation chapter 1, Apostle John, according to Revelation, right, he had a vision of Jesus appearing in his glory, right? But those were distinguished from resurrection appearances, right? Those are not called resurrection appearances. The resurrection appearances apparently ended with Jesus' ascension. I mean, as the ascension was a significant event, right? According to early Christian belief, right? They believe that this happened, and so we want to find how come the resurrection appearances suddenly terminated after these 40 days, except for Paul, this one exception. But otherwise, it kind of ended, right? I mean, if it's group hallucination, it will be something that people cannot control, right? I mean, if it's a hallucination, is their psychological states, right? I mean, they were very excited if that were the case, and they will have mass hallucination after mass hallucination, and then mass hallucination, and it should continue, right? It shouldn't just suddenly terminated right after 40 days, right? So this consideration shows us that there is something outside their mind which is causing this, right? It's not something inside their mind that's playing the tricks, right? There's something outside their mind who appeared to them for a period of 40 days and then went up, right? And that's why the resurrection appearances ended after 40 days, right? And so this is the best explanation. So given all the reasons I presented above, we have good reasons, right, to totally reject the intramental hypothesis, which is utterly ridiculous, and to conclude that the disciples must have experienced something real, right? It must be a real person. It must have been a real person whom they experienced alive.
Yeah, and so going back to the distinction again, so the extramental versus the intramental hypothesis. Also, I wanted to mention one more time. So we've got about 118 people watching right now. Again, this is an unusual time for our stream, but we do have a lot of people watching live. So you may have missed at the very beginning where I mentioned that we're going over a book that Dr. Loke has written called "Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus," and it's linked in the description of this video. What's cool about it is that it's free. It's completely free to download on Kindle, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. So if you're interested in what Dr. Loke is saying, you'd like to kind of see it written out and very systematic and everything, then just go download the book. It's like I said, it's free. So if you're having trouble maybe following along and you want to get deeper into it, go do that. So yeah, let's get into the chapter 5 of your book, where you argue that the extramental reality that they experienced was Jesus. It wasn't some other person or something else. It was Jesus. So what's your sort of overall argument for that? And then we're going to turn to some Q&A from the audience. I don't know how long I've got you, Dr. Loke, but hopefully you can stick around for some Q&A with the audience.
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's up to you, but I think we can go about up to 1 hour. So after we refute the intramental hypothesis, right, we established that there is an extramental entity, right? There's a real person whom they saw, and that and after that, it's very easy to establish that it was Jesus, right? Why? Because those people who claim to have seen Jesus alive, right? Many of them would have known Jesus pretty well. I mean, first of all, Jesus was a public figure, right? So even among the 500 people, right, I think many of them would have known him, hear him preach, and hear him speak, and etc. Right? And certainly for the 12 disciples, they knew him very well, right? Because the 12 disciples were his close followers, right? So so it was not some strangers, right, who claimed to have seen him alive, right? It was people who were closely associated with him, who have lived with him. And if these people did not identify carefully and make sure that it was Jesus, they wouldn't have proclaimed the resurrection and be willing to give out everything for it, as I said earlier on, right? This is something absolutely important for them. And given this, it is very unlikely that all these people mistook another person for Jesus, right? And this is the first reason. Now, the second reason is that this misidentification hypothesis cannot explain the notion of spiritual body. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Now, the earliest Christians believed that Jesus resurrected physically, but it was not normal physical body, right? it was what N.T. Wright would call a trans-physical body, a body that has that is not normal physical, right? I mean, the Gospels tell us that the body can dematerialize, right? So, for example, when Jesus was with the two disciples at Emmaus, and then he suddenly dematerialized. After he broke the bread, he disappeared, right? And he was able to go through closed doors, right? He has this kind of trans-physical ability. Now, and this is amazing. Now, of course, skeptics would doubt this, right? Skeptics will say, well, these are embellishment. Maybe the disciples were exaggerating, whatever. But my response is, if they didn't have experiences like this, right, they wouldn't have come to the conclusion that Jesus was bodily resurrected as the first fruit of what is to come in the future. Okay, so we need to understand the historical context of the earliest Christians. Now, and we also need to distinguish between resurrection and revivification, right, of the corpse. Now, of course, there have been stories about people rising from the dead, right? I mean, according to the Gospels, Jesus also raised Lazarus from the dead, for example. But after Lazarus was risen, he died right after that, right? So he didn't resurrect into some kind of supernatural body, right? I mean, that was not what the earliest Christians believed about Lazarus or other people. But for Jesus, it was different. The earliest Christians believed that he was resurrected into a body that is, which Paul calls it spiritual body, right? In 1 Corinthians 15, right? And this spiritual body, right? And Paul says that Jesus was the first fruit, right? First fruit, which means that the early Christians, they believe that, like the Jews, they believe that there will be an end-time resurrection, right? So in the future, I mean, we all die, but in the future, when Jesus comes again at the end of the world, end of history, we'll all be resurrected and we'll be given a transformed body, right? And this body will no longer die, right? It'll be a body that they will last forever, and so it'll be kind of supernatural body, right? And the earliest Christians believed that Jesus had that kind of body, right? And so we need to explain how did it, why is it that they experienced which convinced them that Jesus had that kind of body. And so Jesus must be able to do those things that I mentioned just now, right? Such as dematerializing, and able to go through locked doors and things like that. And this is not something that natural physical bodies can do, right? So given this is the case, it's unlikely that the disciples mistook another normal person for Jesus, right? Because a normal person will not be able to do things like that, right? So in any case, you need a miracle, right, to explain what is it that they experience, right? So given these two reasons, right? So the first reason is Jesus didn't appear to strangers. I mean, it was not strangers who claimed that they saw Jesus, right? It was people who know Jesus very well. And they can talk to the person. They can, and by talking to a person for a while, you will know whether you are talking to the right guy or not. Even if it's a twin brother, right? Even among twins, right? People can tell the difference, right? After just a short while, people can tell the difference, right? And so, and that's the reason why, right? The misidentification hypothesis is widely rejected, right? The twin brother hypothesis is widely rejected for good reasons, right? And therefore, we have good reasons to conclude that the disciples did not see another person, but what they saw is Jesus, right? It was truly the resurrected Jesus who appeared to them alive.
So one last thing before we move to Q&A is I wanted to ask you, because one of the chapters in your book, you talk about miracles being unlikely, and how that's another common response from atheists, is that miracles are just so unlikely that we should automatically prefer some kind of like naturalistic explanation, regardless of how implausible it is. So how do you respond to that type of objection? And then we'll move to some audience Q&A.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So in chapter 8 of my book, I give a very long argument, right, and to address the problem of miracle. And because we are short of time, I can only give you a brief outline, right, of my case. Now, firstly,
and I think it's okay to just push people if they want the full case to just go download the book for free. I mean, like I said, it's free to download on your Kindle, so there's like no reason for you not to get it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, no reason not to get it. Oh, by the way, before I forget, right, I will also encourage people to go to my academia edu, right? So you can also check out other articles which are written related to the resurrection and Kalam cosmological argument, right? So there's a lot of stuff there, right? And also my book you can download from my website as well, right? My website at academia edu. And also you can subscribe to my YouTube channel where I give talks on these topics quite often, and I sometimes will upload my talks and my debates, right, on my YouTube channel as well. So if you're interested in my research in all these important topics, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and also follow me at my Academia edu website. Okay. Now let me go on and talk about the issue of miracle, right? So of course, skeptics think that miracles are very unlikely. That's a common and that's a quite understandable objection, right? I mean, we don't easily believe in miracles, right? However, I think we can nevertheless, for the case of Jesus' resurrection, I think a good case can be made, right? And firstly, we need to distinguish between the probability of a miraculous claim considered apart from the evidence and the probability of the claim given the evidence, right? So this is a point that Timothy McGrew has emphasized. And I think you have given a talk with McGrew, right? You've given an interview with McGrew, right, Cameron? I understand that. And so
Yes.
I think McGrew is a great expert in this area, right? So, if we just consider the claim of miracle apart from the evidence, then I would agree it's very unlikely, right? But if we consider, but we shouldn't do that when we think about probability, right? We should consider the what is the probability given the evidence, right? And this can be shown using Bayesian theorem, which I think McGrew will explain, right? So, given the evidence, it may not be probable. It depends on the evidence, actually, right? So this is a very important point. Now, to illustrate this point, suppose you and your community grew up in a hot jungle and had never seen ice before, right? You've never seen ice. And suppose someone from Europe visited you in your jungle and told you that water can be frozen. Okay? Now, if you say, of course, it's more likely that the report is mistaken. I mean, we know that people often get things wrong. I mean, we know that often people exaggerate. People even lie, and we know that there are a lot of mistaken reports. And these are mistaken reports are common occurrence. And on the other hand, we have never seen ice before, right? Therefore, we should conclude that what this guy is saying is false, right? Now, of course, if you argue this way, you'll be wrong, right? Because we know that there are ice, right? But if you reason this way, right? If you think that this is so unlikely because you've never seen ice before, you think that it's unlikely, and you think that because people do make mistakes, therefore you reject the claim, and then you'll be wrong, right? So the moral of this story is that we need to consider the specific evidence for this case, right? For this person who claimed that there is ice, right? We cannot just simply dismiss it by saying that, we know that we have not seen this, therefore it's unlikely, right? I mean, we shouldn't just dismiss it. We need to look into the specific evidence, right? We need to investigate, right? I mean, yes, there have been many mistaken reports, right? I mean, there are a lot of miraculous claims which have been debunked, right? And I discussed this actually in chapter 8 of my book, right? So in chapter 8 of my book, I go through stories of resurrection, right, in other cultures, right? I mentioned just now about Sabbatai Zevi, right? I mentioned him, and I also mentioned Sneerson, the case, right? So it's not the case that it's not the case that we just uncritically and gullibly believe in miracles, right? Of course not. We have to be skeptical. We have to be critical, right? So I discuss in chapter 8. I give the reasons why those so-called miracles are based on mistaken reports, right? We have good reasons. We can demonstrate that, right? If you read chapter 8 of my book, you'll find those, right? So we know that there are a lot of mistaken reports about miracles, but that doesn't mean that the fact that we have a lot of such reports doesn't mean that all reports of miracles are therefore false, right? It'll be a kind of false generalization, right? Just like the case of ice that I mentioned just now, right? Somebody claimed that there was ice to people who never seen ice before, right? I mean, it would be false for them to make a kind of general statement and then dismiss the claim. I mean, that wouldn't be right. Rather, we need to consider the evidence that's specific to this case, right? And that's how we should assess the probability, right? And therefore, similarly, we also should consider the evidence that's specific to the particular case of Jesus' resurrection, right? And that is important, right? We shouldn't just make some general remarks that there have been many mistaken reports, therefore the Bible is probably mistaken. I mean, that will be too sloppy, right? That will be too sloppy. So as I already explained just now, when we look into the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, right, we find that there is actually pretty good evidence, right? The report is not mistaken, right? As I said earlier on, we have multiple reasons to show that the disciples did see something, and what they saw is the resurrected Jesus, right? So we can conclude that Jesus did rise from the dead. And so this is the first point. Now, the second point is that there's no good reason. One reason, I should say, the one reason why skeptics think that miracles are why they think that resurrection of Jesus is unlikely is because they think that the prior probability is low, right? And the reason why they think that the prior probability is low is because they think that it's something that is infrequent, right? I mean, we don't see people rising from the dead all the time. I mean, hardly any, right? In fact, on the contrary, I saw my grandfather died, he didn't rise from the dead. I saw my father died, he didn't rise from the dead. And so resurrection, even if it did happen, is something that is absolutely infrequent, right? And so because it is so rare, if it happened at all, right? Skeptics think that it has very low prior probability, right? And that's their main consideration. Now, my response is that when we evaluate rare hypotheses, infrequency is not the main consideration. Rather, the main consideration is the reason for the infrequency. Why is it infrequent? Now, in the case of evaluating natural impersonal causes, infrequencies can help us exclude natural impersonal causes and naturalistic alternatives to Jesus' resurrection. And this is an important point. Now, why is this point important? Because now skeptics sometimes argue this way, right? Skeptics sometimes argue that, well, you Christian apologists, you are being inconsistent. Why? Because when we talk about the hallucination, right? You Christian apologists will say that, well, that is so improbable, right? Because it's not found in peer-reviewed literature, as that's what Habermas claimed, right? It's so rare, it's so improbable. We didn't see it happen, therefore we reject it. But when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, right, you all say that, well, it happened even though we didn't see other cases of resurrection, right? So skeptics think that we are inconsistent, right? Because when we appeal to infrequency to rule out as part of the reason against hallucination, whereas we don't appeal to infrequency when we talk about the resurrection. You see what I mean? Okay. Now, my response to this is that, as I said earlier on, we need to understand what is the reason for the infrequency, right? In the case of naturalistic explanation, in the case of, say, for example, hallucination, right? We can use infrequency to rule those out. Why? Because those hypotheses are supposed to involve impersonal natural causes, which are supposed to follow regular causal laws, right? So given what we understand about the causal laws that cause our experience, right, we know that it is very unreasonable to think that a group of people can be seeing the same thing together when there's in fact nothing there, right? I already explained it just now, right? It's very unreasonable to think that the causal processes internal to each person's mind can be generating the same experience when there's actually nothing outside their mind, right? So this is on the basis of causal laws, regularities, right? And so on the basis of these regularities, we can conclude that mass hallucination is improbable, and that's the reason why it is infrequent, right? But when we talk about miracle, it's a different thing. Why? Because a miracle is not supposed to be an event. A miracle, if it did happen at all, right, it's not supposed to be an event that is caused by natural laws, right? It is not supposed to be a kind of regularity. Rather, it's supposed to be an event that's caused by a free agent, right? God, right? And God may have reasons for doing miracles only on rare occasions, right? So, for example, if you ask, why did God choose to raise Jesus? I mean, if Jesus did raise from the dead, right? You might ask, so why only Jesus? Why not Gautama, Buddha? Why not Muhammad? Right? Why Jesus? The answer is maybe because Jesus was special, right? Maybe because Jesus was really God incarnate. And that's the reason why God chose to raise Jesus, but not Muhammad, but not Gautama, right? Because Jesus is special. And so God has reasons to raise only Jesus, but not other people, right? This is a simple explanation. And therefore, we shouldn't use frequency, right? We shouldn't use frequency to dismiss miracles, right? That would be a false way of reasoning, okay? So this is the second point, okay? And now the third point I want to say is that in the absence of evidence, miraculous claims are indeed unlikely, as I said earlier on. But the reason is not because we can read the mind of God to know that it's unlikely that God will not do a miracle in this case. But in the absence of evidence, we know that there have been many mistaken reports of miracles, as I said earlier on, right? So they will take up the probability space, right, in that case. What I'm saying is that if there were no good evidence for Jesus' resurrection, if there were no good evidence, then we have good reasons, right, not to believe it, because there will be much more common naturalistic alternatives, right? If there were no good reasons, then we know that there are common natural explanations such as fraud, hallucination. Yeah, so maybe it was just one or two person hallucinate. I mean, these are common natural explanation. Given the absence of evidence, if we have no good evidence to rule out these other naturalistic alternatives, then we will conclude that the resurrection, the probability will be low, right? So let me repeat again. if there are no good evidence to rule out the naturalistic alternatives, right? If there were no good evidence to rule out, if there were no good evidence to rule out a fraud or a hallucination, then I will agree, right, that the probability for the resurrection is low, right? However, in the case of Jesus' resurrection, it's the opposite, right? We have good evidence to rule out all the other naturalistic alternatives, right? As I demonstrate using my logical syllogism, right? And so we have good reasons to rule out all the other naturalistic alternatives. So given which, we can have good reasons to conclude that the probability for Jesus' resurrection is high. And this is an important point because this addresses the point about a claim that skeptics often made, which is that extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. Right? I'm sure you all have thought about this before, right? Skeptics often claim that extraordinary claims would require extraordinary evidence. Now, my response...
That's actually the subject of the interview that I did with Tim McGrew.
Okay. Yeah, so my response to this claim is that now Tim McGrew mentioned in his article that we have to be careful here because we shouldn't use extraordinary, we shouldn't let it form an insuperable obstacle, right? To believe, because that may stop us from believing in extraordinary events if it really did happen. So we have to be careful here. So the question is, how extraordinary, right, should the evidence be? Right? How extraordinary should it be? Now, my response is that the evidence should be extraordinary to the extent that it is enough to rule out the alternative explanation, the naturalistic alternative explanation. Okay, so let me give an analogy. Okay, so suppose if I told you that I just saw a plane this afternoon flying across my hotel, right? I just saw a plane flying across my hotel. Well, no, there's nothing extraordinary about this. No, we know that there are planes flying across all the time. Yeah, so you can easily believe me, right? Without demanding more evidence. I mean, yeah, you can take my word for it, right? I just saw a plane flying across the hotel this afternoon. However, if I tell you that I saw a UFO descended into my hotel and I was visited by an alien, right? Now this will be an extraordinary claim, and you shouldn't just easily believe me on that, just on my word, right? You would demand more evidence. You will need to rule, and the reason why you would want to demand more evidence is because you will want to rule out other alternative explanation, right? You will want to rule out, could it be that Andrew Loke is having a hallucination, right? Could it be that, or could it be that I'm lying about this, right? So you will need evidence to you need to look at it more carefully, right? Because you need to because this is extraordinary claim, right? You need to assess it more carefully. You need to be careful to make sure that you have the evidence to rule out the alternatives before you conclude that I indeed saw an alien, right? So to arrive at the truth, right, you will need to make sure that you have more evidence in that sense, right? So what I'm trying to say is that you need to be extraordinary in the sense that you need to be good enough, right, to rule out other explanation. And what I'm saying is that in the case of Jesus' resurrection, we do have that evidence, right? And that is extraordinary. Why? Because in the case of other claims about resurrection, we do not have those evidence to rule out other explanation. Right? So as I mentioned just now, right, I discussed various claims of miracles in chapter 8 of my book, right? I discussed the claim of Sabbatai Zebi, right, and Sneerson, right? So claim that they resurrected. But in those other cases, we do not have enough evidence to rule out other explanation. So, for example, in the case of Sneerson, right, how many people claim to have seen him alive after he died? Well, actually, hardly any. It was like one or two people. It was not like groups of people, who saw him alive, right? So, in that case, we don't have good evidence to rule out the hallucination hypothesis, right? If it was just only a few people, individuals at certain time, right? And on the other hand, we have strong counter evidence, right? As I said earlier on, right? Most of his followers, in fact, think that he didn't resurrect. Right? Why? Because his physical body, is still buried in New York, right? So his body is still in the tomb, right? So we know that he didn't resurrect, right? So the opposite is the case for Jesus' resurrection. I mean, his body is no longer there, and many people saw him alive, right? So this is what I mean, right? So in other cases of supposed miracles or miraculous claims, we don't have good evidence to rule out alternative explanation. In fact, we have good reasons to think that to explain those away, right? Those are probably hallucination or fraud or legends or whatever, right? In those other cases, but the case of Jesus' resurrection is extraordinary, right? Because in this case, we do have the evidence to rule out other alternative and conclude that Jesus rise from the dead. So it is extraordinary. So therefore, we do have extraordinary evidence in this case. Okay. Now, one more point. When I think one major contribution which my book makes to the discussion is this, right? Because if you read other books about Jesus' resurrection, right? So I mean, a lot of people have wrote great books about Jesus' resurrection, right? And we think of people like N.T. Wright, right, and Lycona, right? So in 2003, N.T. Wright wrote a 800 over page book, right? The big book, Resurrection of the Son of God, right? To try to show that Jesus resurrected, right? And so I was curious, what objections do skeptics have to that book, right? So, for example, I read reviews by Dale Ellison, right? And so Ellison wrote that, N.T. Wright, he discussed a lot about the textual evidence, but he did not exclude all the possible alternatives. I mean, there could be various, maybe some other hypothesis that we have not thought of yet, right? So maybe there are other possible ways to explain away the evidence. Well, perhaps, right? Who knows, right? So he thinks that N.T. Wright did not do a good job, right, to exclude the other alternatives, right? And when I read Lycona book, I also have the same sensation. I mean, his discussion is a bit, of the alternatives is not systematic, right? I mean, he discussed hallucination and he discussed this and that, but he didn't show how is it that other alternatives can be excluded systematically, right? So I was a bit concerned about that. And so, and given that this is the case, it is a weakness to the resurrection argument, right? If you cannot show systematically how you can exclude the other alternatives, and if that were the case, then you have a problem, because if you talk to skeptics, right, as I said just now, they raise the concern about prior probability, right? So I have argued just now that there's no good reason to think that the prior probability is low, right, for the case of Jesus' resurrection. But then they will ask, but do you have any good reason to think that the prior probability is high? How do you know that it's likely that God will raise Jesus, right? How high do you think the prior probability is, right? And this is a consideration they will raise, because they think that, as Lycona mentioned, right, you have to address the plausibility of a hypothesis. And to assess the plausibility of a hypothesis, you need to consider the prior probability, right? The prior probability, right? And but then the prior probability of a miracle is a very tricky issue, right? Because because we can't read the mind of God, right? I mean, we can't read the mind of God to know how likely is it that he will do a miracle in this case but not in other case. I mean, this is not easy. This is a very tricky issue. Now, of course, there are philosophers who have addressed this, right? So people like Richard Swinburne, he wrote a book published by Oxford University Press in 2003. I mean, he argues that there is a high prior probability that God will raise Jesus, right? Given Jesus' character, his teachings, etc., right? His claims by himself, things like that. So Richard Swinburne did offer some arguments to try to argue that the prior probability is high in this case. Right? However, there are others who raise objections, right? So people like Robert Kevin, right? Craig Kevin, right? He has written some criticism of Swinburne on this point. Now, Swinburne has responded, actually. So I think that, yes, I think that perhaps a case can indeed be made, right? I think that a case can be made for thinking that, well, the prior probability is not low, right, in this case. However, my approach avoids the problem totally, right? Because on my approach, it doesn't face the problem of prior probability. Why? Because we can, on my exclusionary approach, we can leave the prior probability of resurrection to one side and consider what is the probability of all the alternatives, right? Now, as I said just now, my argument is logically exhaustive, right? It shows, it categorizes all the hypotheses exhaustively, and we have good considerations against the essential characteristics of each hypothesis, right? So we have good reasons to think that each alternative is unlikely, right? And given that this is logically exhaustive, all the probabilities must add up to one, right? All the probabilities must add up to get to all the alternatives plus the resurrection. All this must add up to one, right? So given that we have good reasons to think that the naturalistic alternatives are unlikely, so we can assign a probability, right? Say for example, Timothy McGrew thinks that the hallucination hypothesis is really negligible, right? He says negligible probability, right? Which means 0.0000000 something, right? It's very unlikely, right? But suppose we are generous, okay? Suppose we give it the probability of 0.1, 1 in 1,000 mass hallucination, right? I mean, that is already extremely generous, right? 0.1 probability, right? So even if we are so generous to assign so high a probability to hallucination, mass hallucination, intramental hypothesis, 0.1, and the no, even if we assign 0.1, right, to each naturalistic alternative, what we have here, when we add up all together the rest of the alternatives, and there are 6 of them, right? We add them up, right? It's only 0.6, right? And so the rest of the probability space will be taken up by the resurrection, right? So what this means is that we can conclude that the resurrection of Jesus happened with a probability of 99.4%, right? Even without having to assign a prior probability, right, to the resurrection, right? So it avoids the issue, it avoids the difficulty about assigning prior probability, right, altogether, because we can do it by exclusion, right, of the rest. We know that the rest are unlikely, right? And so we can exclude them, and what left behind is the probability of the resurrection, right? So we can conclude that the resurrection of Jesus happened with at least a probability of 99.4%, right? And that is enough to convince, right? That ought to be enough to convince any reasonable person that Jesus did rose from the dead.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on something right as we're about to move into the Q&A from the audience. Excuse me, I've got a cough again. So what I really don't like is the distinction between natural and supernatural. So if I think that we do away with this distinction, then we can no longer say something like, okay, what are the naturalistic alternatives? What are the supernaturalistic alternatives? I don't think that's a good distinction. So if we do away with that, because I think what happens is that there's some sort of baggage that gets brought along with these kinds of distinctions. So if we do away with those, then what we're doing, well, what you're doing, is you're ruling out various different possible explanations. And we're just basically looking at our pool of explanations and seeing which one is best. So it's not like, to me, it's just like if we assign that name, or if we use that name, that label, naturalistic explanation versus a supernaturalistic explanation, then there's already sort of a prejudice against the supernaturalistic explanations, when in reality what we should be doing, because the distinction is just a bad one in the first place, in reality what we're doing is we're just comparing hypotheses. Like that's it. And what you've done is you've ruled out, or at least you've said or argued, that all of these different other alternatives, we just call them alternatives, they're all unlikely, very, very unlikely. And so the best alternative, the best explanation, is that Jesus was raised from the dead, that God raised Jesus from the dead. What are your thoughts on that? Doing away with this sort of distinction, and maybe that'll help sort of clear up the kind of the, because I think it does kind of prejudice people against that particular explanation when really there's no good reason to do that.
Okay, so yeah, we can discuss about the use of labels, right? So the word supernatural, as you say, right, has a kind of connotation, right? For a lot of people, I mean, psychologically, a lot of people think that, well, is that magic or whatever, right? So a lot of people would just dismiss it, right, when they hear the word supernatural. And so
Right.
It's unfortunate that the word has this kind of, it's unfortunate that this word has that kind of connotation, right? But nevertheless, I think we still need to distinguish between causal processes, right? Causal processes, and it's important to think about it in that way, right? So as John Collins, who is an Old Testament scholar, right? I mean, he responded to N.T. Wright on this point, actually, because N.T. Wright, like yourself, N.T. Wright also doesn't like the word supernatural, right? N.T. Wright thinks that the word supernatural and natural is like is a kind of distinction that is probably foreign to the worldview of ancient Jews in the first in ancient Jews, right? So N.T. Wright wants to do away with that distinction. He thinks it's not a good way to think about when we interpret the Bible. However, John Collins, Old Testament scholar, right? He responded by saying that even in the ancient world, people do understand that events such as virgin birth, right? Virgin birth of Mary. I mean, events such as virgin birth is not something that happen by usually by the causal processes which God has created, right? Rather, if such a thing happened, then something must have intervened, right, into the normal processes, right? And people do understand this kind of distinction, right? People wouldn't take a virgin birth as something that is normal, for example, right? And so I think the distinction still needs to be maintained when we think of it in causal terms, right? So and therefore I don't think we can simply abandon the distinction so easily, right? I think in causal terms there is certainly a distinction. And the second reason why I want to and the second thought I have about this issue is that we need to think about other possible hypotheses. Right? Now, just now, what I listed just now, those 6 alternatives, there is a reason why I call them naturalistic alternatives. There's a reason why I call them naturalistic. Why? Because there are some other alternatives out there which we haven't discussed yet, right? And these other alternatives will be like, for example, the Islamic hypothesis, where they think that God, Allah, caused a hallucination among people, such that they crucified the wrong guy, right? I mean, that's one alternative. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation was offered by Shabir Ali, right? I think he has another view about this. He thinks that Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die, right? And then Allah rose him, right? Miraculously exalted him. But he wasn't resurrected. It wasn't resurrection. It was just exaltation, because according to Shabir Ali, Jesus didn't die, right? But Allah exalted him, right, from miraculously. So there are these other alternatives out there, right, which are not natural explanation. I mean, these are not based on natural causal pathways of our universe, right? This cannot be explained using physics or biology or whatever. But this involves the intervention of Allah, according to Islam, right? Of intervention of Allah into the whole world, right? And so what do we do with these other hypotheses, right? What do we do with them, right? So I think the natural supernatural distinction is helpful for classifying all these other these other hypotheses under supernatural, right? And therefore, what I'm trying to say is this, right? After we have ruled out the naturalistic alternatives, we can conclude that a miracle happened, right? And so, how do we explain this miracle? Do we take it at face value that Jesus raised from the dead, or do we have to consider the Islamic hypothesis, others, right? And when we come to that stage of the arguments, historical evidence by itself is no longer enough, because we need to think about philosophical and theological considerations, right? So is it likely that God deceived us, right? Or is it likely that God deceived the earliest Christians, right, into thinking that he resurrected when in fact he didn't, right? In fact, it was just exaltation, right? Is it likely that happened, right? I mean, that was the argument that William Lane Craig and Mike McCona has given against Shabir Ali, right? They argue that Shabir Ali's hypothesis is theologically problematic, right? To think that God would cause this kind of delusion, right, among people, right? But that's a total different ballgame, right? We have to now we are talking about theological, philosophical considerations apart from the historical evidence, right? So what I'm trying to say is this, right? The historical evidence can get us so far, right? It can rule out the historical evidence can rule out the naturalistic alternatives and conclude that Jesus resurrected, right? But then to exclude other claims like the Islamic hypothesis, right? We have to use other philosophical and theological considerations. And this is an important point, because nowadays I have heard quite a number of skeptics, right, who try to respond to Jesus' resurrection by using these other kind of theories, right? These other kinds of theories that involves causation, not in the way that we understand them, right? It involves additional things intervening. So, for example, I mentioned Allah just now. Then there are others who have claimed about aliens. Have you heard about the alien hypothesis, right? So there's this guy called Shapiro, right? He wrote a book in 2016 about the resurrection, right? He argues that, well, Christians can never establish that, because we need to rule out aliens causing resurrection, right? Or something less than God. Maybe another God caused the resurrection, or maybe angel, or maybe demon, or Satan, whatever, right? So he appealed to these other hypothesis, right? So we need to address them, right? We can use the arguments of natural theology, for example, right? We can use the arguments of the Kalam cosmological argument, which I use, right, to establish that our universe has a creator. And so what I will argue against the alien hypothesis is that, on the one hand, right, we have the Kalam cosmological argument to show that there is a creator God, right? On the other hand, we don't have any good evidence to think that there are aliens of such powers and intelligence. I mean, scientists speculate that maybe they are aliens, maybe they are not, right? And even if they are aliens, we don't have any good evidence at the moment to think that they do intervene, they have the powers to intervene in our world, right? We don't have any evidence about that. But on the other hand, we do have arguments to show that there is a creator who created the universe, right? So using the Kalam argument, right? So given that there is such a creator who would definitely have the power to raise the dead, given that he can create the laws of nature, right? The universe, and we have better reasons to believe that the resurrection of Jesus was caused by God rather than caused by aliens, right? So this is how I would respond to this kind of challenge. And so in short, I think that the distinction I mean, we might not want to use the word supernatural or natural. I mean, we can think of another term, right, which has no such connotations, right? But at the end of the day, I think the distinction about causal processes are relevant, important for us to make the case, right, about Jesus' resurrection, and to demonstrate the theological significance of Jesus' resurrection, right? So what if Jesus resurrected? Well, we would need to argue that Jesus' resurrection is a vindication of his claim to be divine, right? And we have other considerations to show that there are good reasons to think that there is indeed such a God who created the universe, right? And so this will form a complete Christian worldview, right? And you'll give us good reasons to conclude that the God who created the universe has intervened in history, in the person of Jesus Christ, right, to vindicate his claim and to demonstrate that he has sent Jesus. Jesus came from him into the world, right, to show us, to accomplish the gospel for us, accomplish salvation for us, right, for all humankind. Yeah. So that is an important point.
Okay, let's move on to audience questions. So this one is from Caleb Jackson. Thank you for sending in the super chat, Caleb. He says, how would you respond to instances of mass hysteria or group illusions? Marian apparitions, ghosts, clouds. Is it possible that groups of people could have mistaken something like these for the risen Jesus?
Okay. As I said earlier on, his hysteria is not enough to do the job, right? Because hysteria is a kind of belief, right? Whereas what we have here in the case of the earliest Christians is that they not only believed that Jesus resurrected, they actually saw something, right? So hysteria by itself cannot explain that away. And the other thing is you also mentioned illusions. So illusions will be a kind of misidentification. So in the case of Marian apparitions, now there are various theories about those, right? So and there are also various different events which have been claimed to be the appearance of Mary, right? So there's one incident when people look into the sun, right, and thought that Mary was appearing to them, right? But through the sun, right? She appeared in the sunlight, and that is not a hallucination actually, because there is something extramental there, right? That the sun was there, right? And some people have argued that maybe it was the sun. Maybe when you look at the sun too much, right, it will cause your sensation to be distorted. Right? I mean, too much sunlight, right, is not good for your eyes, right, and not good for your and then plus the fact that people, and so people may be predisposed, right, to have illusions, right, of Mary, right, distorted images, for example, which they interpret as Mary's appearing to them, right, and so that's how we can look at those other cases. But in the case of Jesus' resurrection, as I said earlier on, hysteria cannot explain this away, and illusion also cannot explain this away, right? Because as I said, illusion will be a kind of misidentification, right? Misidentifying something else as Jesus. But as I explained earlier on, right? Jesus, it was not strangers who claimed to have seen Jesus, right? It was people who actually knew him well, and they didn't just conclude that Jesus was exalted into the sky like Mary was, like that. I mean, the Marian apparition actually, was regarded like a kind of exaltation, right? She was exalted in heaven, but she wasn't regarded as bodily resurrected. I mean, the apparition wasn't taken as evidence that she was bodily alive, right? But in the case of Jesus' resurrection, it was the foundational belief for the earliest Christians, and some foundational event must have caused the earliest Christians to believe that Jesus was bodily resurrected, not just exalted into the sky, right, but bodily resurrected. And as I said earlier on, right, there's multiple attestation of Jesus eating with the disciples and having close communion with them and giving them the Great Commission, etc. Right? So given that this was not claimed by strangers but by people who know him well, right, we can conclude that it was the same Jesus, right, that the disciples experienced. It was not a kind of illusion or misidentification. Yeah.
Okay, let's get to the next question. This one is from Maverick Christian. I think you may know about him. Here's his question. How is Paul inviting them to check the witnesses for themselves if he doesn't say where they lived? Okay. Now, as I said earlier on, when we read the letters of the earliest Christians, we need to read it with a bit of common sense. Okay, and we need to understand that those letters are not exhaustive
of the communication that Paul would have had with the people in Corinth, right? It's just like, if I wrote an email to my wife, right? If you just read my email, you won't get the full story of my relationship with my wife, right? Because I not only wrote letters to her, I also talked with her. I met her, right? And I meet her often, right? And we have conversations, and I will tell her things that are not found in my letters. Okay. So likewise, Paul is not writing to strangers here, right? Paul is writing to the Corinthians who knew him well. He was the one who set up the church in Corinth, right? And so he visited Corinth before. He had preached among them. He would have told them many things which are not recorded in the letters. And it is very commonsensical, right, to think that sometimes things which are common beliefs, which are shared beliefs among the author and the audience, this will not be required to be included in the letter. So, for example, when I write my write my email to my wife, when I send message to my wife, when I say that the children are at home, right, you can check out with them, right? I don't have to tell her that our home address is 5 Simei Street 3 in Singapore, right? Postal code 468558, right? I don't have to tell her all those information, right? Oh, by the way, those are not accurate. I'm just making it up, right? Because I don't want to tell people my real address. But anyway, I'm just giving an analogy, right? I don't have to tell my wife my exact address, right? Because she knew where to find my children at home, right? She know what I mean by at home, right? I mean, those are shared beliefs that we have, right? So you get my point, right? What I'm saying is that Paul wouldn't have to tell the address details of all the 500 witnesses, list them down, address one by one in that First Corinthians. That wouldn't have been necessary, right? Given that this will be common knowledge. Paul was appealing to common knowledge between him and his audience, right? Paul was saying that, you guys, know that there's good reason to think that Jesus is resurrected, right? Given that this is the case, how come there are some of you, maybe some new believers, right? Who think that there's no resurrection among the dead, right? I mean, there are some, as I said, there are some skeptics among them, right? But for the rest, they would have heard this story again and again, right? This was the gospel that he preached to them before, and he remind them again that there are these people who have seen Jesus alive, right? And these people can still be checked, right? You know them, you can check with them, right? And so Paul is appealing to common knowledge here.
Okay, so I think we're going to do one more question and then close it out today. So this one is from Kyle Barrington. He says, Dr. Loke, have you asked any skeptics about what evidence they would accept as justification for the resurrection if it truly happened? And what did they say and how did you respond?
Oh, okay. Well, this is an interesting question. Now, of course, different skeptics would have different answers, right, to this question. This is like asking a skeptic, well, what evidence would you have in order to believe that there is a God? And different people have different answers to this question, right? So we know that Richard Dawkins has said something like, if God is going to rearrange the stars in the sky, the galaxies, right, to form the words "Jesus loves you" or something like that, right? If God is revealed that way, then maybe I will accept. Or but I mean, he didn't say he will accept, but he said maybe. But anyway, different people have different kind of answers to this question. I mean, and it's related to the degree of evidence, right? That they will accept, right, for this case. And in the case of Jesus' resurrection, I mean, I have heard people say that, well, if Jesus revealed himself to me tonight, right, in my dreams, or if he appeared in front of me, right, then I will accept, right. So some people would demand that kind of evidence, right. Now, but there are also other people who don't demand that kind of evidence, right. There are also other people who say, for example, I've given many talks on the resurrection before. Both in my class, in my philosophy of religion class, and also in preaching in churches, right, in conferences, I've talked about Jesus' resurrection. And sometimes by just presenting the evidence, skeptics become convinced, right? There are people who became Christians after that, right? So, so the level of evidence, I mean, is different from individual to individual, right? And now, what about for those people who demand a very high degree of evidence, right? What about those people who say that, well, I want Jesus to appear before me, right, before I accept. How do I respond to those people? Now, it's very interesting because there was one time when I talked about Jesus' resurrection in the cell group, and there was one guy who had this question, right, but he didn't say it out, right? But I give the answer, which actually addressed his question, and in the end, he became a Christian that night. So it was really amazing. I'm very thankful for that. Okay, so the answer I gave was that, firstly, the lack of more evidence doesn't mean that there's no evidence at all, right? And this is a point that William Lane Craig has made. Craig has argued that the lack of more evidence doesn't mean that there's no evidence at all. So the fact that we don't have evidence like Jesus appearing to me every day, right? We don't have those evidence. We don't have evidence like God making the galaxies show God loves you in the sky. We don't have those obvious evidence, right? The fact that there's no such, the fact that there's no more obvious evidence for God or resurrection doesn't mean that there's no evidence at all. On the other hand, we already have enough evidence, right, to conclude that God exists, right? So based on the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, and we really have enough evidence to conclude that Jesus resurrected, right? As I demonstrated just now, right? So those evidence is already enough, right, to establish the conclusion, right? So even if we don't have more evidence, that doesn't mean that we don't have sufficient evidence, right? In fact, we already have sufficient evidence, right, to establish a conclusion. So this is my first point. And my second point is we need to ask, why is it that God doesn't give us more evidence, right? Why is it that God doesn't make himself more obvious to us? And there are various reasons for this, right? And William Lane Craig explained this in his book, Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview. So one possible reason is that it may be because God wants to allow us to go through moral testing, right? So for example, if I tell my children, do not eat the sweets on the table, and if I were to remain in front of my children all the time, then of course my children wouldn't eat the sweets, right? I mean, they will say that daddy is obviously here, right? I wouldn't want to eat the sweets on the table, right? However, if I want my children to go through moral testing, I want to test them, and what I can do is I can hide behind the door, right? I can hide outside the room, and then my children would struggle, right? They will say, well, it seems that Papa is not here, right? Do I want to eat the sweets or do I not want to eat sweets? Right? To eat or not to eat, right? That would be the question, right? So my point is that to answer this question, we need to understand what is the reason why God created human beings in the first place, right? It is not just merely to believe in him, but more importantly, to have a personal relationship with him, right? And this personal relationship is a relationship of love, right? God wants us to receive his love, to receive his salvation, which Jesus accomplished for us on the cross, and also to receive him as Savior and Lord, right? And to love him back, right? So this love relationship between God and human beings would require us to go through testing, right? A relationship will require people to go through moral testing, right? To test our commitment, for example, right? And so this testing will allow the relationship to show itself, right? To grow actually, right? Through the testing, through the process. And so there are reasons why sometimes God allow us, right, to go through a period of doubting, for example, right? And it's all part of the testing, right? And so if God were to appear to us so obviously, right, then we won't go through this testing, right? But then there are reasons why God want to choose to hide himself partially in some ways, not totally, because he did leave, as I said earlier on, he has already left behind enough evidence, right, for us to know that he exists. He's there, right? We know that he's there. We have good reasons to think that he's there, right? So God did not hide himself totally. It's not total hiddenness, right? It's partial hiddenness, right? So this partial hiddenness will allow us the freedom, the space, right, to make our choices, our moral choices, right? And this is important part of the our relationship with him is an important part to the meaning of life, right? A meaningful life which God wants us to live.
So we're gonna close it out in just a few minutes, but I wanted to reiterate one thing, and that is that Dr. Loke's book on the resurrection, that the subject that we've been talking about today, is, again, it's free to download. It's linked in the description of this video. So the way that it's free to download is on Kindle, and you can get a Kindle app on your iPhone. You can have a Kindle app on your Amazon tablet or whatever else. It's all free. So you can download this book for free, read it, consider what he's got to say, and I think it'll help you a lot. So I just wanted to reiterate that. And then, Dr. Loke, I wanted to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the audience as we close out the show today?
Well, I want to say that as I was preparing for today's interview, I was once again reminded myself of the reality of Jesus' resurrection. Right, that there's such good evidence to show that this is that has happened. And this gives us such good reasons, right, to think that what we believe is true, right? That Jesus truly rose from the dead is actually